we have a food supply chain that is in need of transformation to make it healthier, more sustainable, and more democratic at scale. And I think what the exciting thing for me is we already had some of the best companies in the world, whether it's innovators like Beyond Meat or large agricultural companies like Cargill. They all know we need to transform the food system and make it healthier and more sustainable. I think that will absolutely be a mission coming out of this.
This is The Safari. The Safari is a tour around the consumer, brand, and retailing industry. And we have the great privilege here at my company, Traub, to really be exposed to many of the great minds of the industry who are forming and shaping the future of many different parts of the consumer, brand, and retail world. And I felt it was quite interesting for us to be able to not only learn from all of those people as we do every day, but memorialize it into a podcast, which could then be shared with many of our friends and clients and you, obviously, the listener. We are the beginning of June, and my next guest joins me as we are both in quarantine from upstate New York. Erik Oken is the Global Head of Consumer Retail Investment Banking at J.P. Morgan, where he has for decades worked and is really at the top of his game when it comes to understanding not just retail and consumer, but how things are moving across the globe, because he is indeed the head of global in this category. So seeing his vantage point is very important to me, and I'm sure you'll find it incredibly interesting as well. So we should really get started. Erik, thank you so much for joining me on the Safari during these very strange times.
Oh, thanks for having me. Delighted to do it.
Just to give some signposting to everyone who's listening, and I'm going to jump right in because given your perch, there's lots of things we can touch on. I think the macro global perspective is vital to everyone. The retail reckoning, or the violent acceleration of the things that we all felt were coming, but obviously just arrived very quickly. The private equity landscape, the Amazon and digital landscape, digital native brands. There's a lot of people saying that they're out maybe, or maybe they're not so out. And then just the future in general. We'll bop around all these different areas. But for those of our listeners who don't know you, give us a few minutes on your position and your history there at J.P. Morgan, where I actually started my career.
Well, very quickly, Morty, I think you summarized it well, which is I'm currently the head of our Global Consumer Retail Investment Banking Group, which does everything, works with companies, everything from agriculture, food, personal care companies, all through the value chain, retailers, department stores, digitally native businesses. So we do get to see a really interesting cross-section globally of the consumer economy. I've been at the firm for 30 years. I spent the first 10 years in our equities business and the last 20 years advising and financing consumer retail companies.
I don't want to go too much into the COVID situation, but how are brands and retailers reacting to the crisis based on how their governments are reacting? You know, what have been some of the differences globally that you've seen, you know, from all of your offices from around the world, depending on the stage at which the crisis has reached their businesses and how their governments have dealt with it?
I think both on our own platform and also with our clients, you've sort of alluded to what the primary issue is at what point of the crisis and in terms of infection those regions are in. How they respond to it is very much as it is the way they respond to a lot of things. It's shaped by culture, it's shaped by government organizations, it's shaped by attitudes towards privacy. So to try to compare what Yum China or what a luxury company in China is doing to what happens in the United States is there are some teachable moments. There's some information we can share with our clients about how to operate under quarantine, supply chain resiliency, some of how to deal with the navigating some of the economic and governmental issues. But the reality is each of these countries, as we knew, have different consumers, different economies, different laws, and different notions of privacy. So, it's always good to get a global perspective and to benchmark. I think, for example, what's been going on in China and Hong Kong in terms of focus on the problem, social distancing, the use of technology in a way that is almost impossible in countries that have different attitudes towards privacy has been, instructive, I think, for many of our companies about how they want to, live going forward and how they want to function going forward. But there are many things that are being done in those countries that can't be done here. I think the other thing that's probably different, very different, is the governmental structures. The United States, for example, is really 4 or 5 countries in terms of regions. And a lot of the laws that control when you can open, how you can open, are really shaped by states and municipalities. So if you're a global company and one that's functioning in the US, who you go to get information about what you can and can't do is a very different question.
So you referenced China, and one of our clients for the last 15 years is Scott Malkin's Value Retail, which is the Bicester Village shopping collection. And they opened now about 5 or 6 weeks ago. They had been shut in Pudong and Suzhou for about 6 weeks. And remarkably, they are up about 100%, I think, in Shanghai, May over May, and they were 80% up in Suzhou. And actually, year to date, they are up against last year, having been closed for an extended period of time, which is remarkable. So do you see that in any way as a leading indicator? Yes, they're Chinese consumers, and we know they are absolutely wonderful consumers, but is that a leading indicator for what might happen in the rest of the world?
It absolutely does. And one of the things you find during, great global moments or national moments of crisis is there tends to be a lot of thinking that unfortunately sounds very similar. And what I see in this crisis is, I think, some real empathy. I see people thinking about issues around health, interacting, collective action that are really exciting. But I also see some stuff that just troubles me in terms of, I think, people misreading human nature and the consumer. And what I mean by that is the notion that we can now all move to Greenwich, Connecticut and conduct everything we do via Zoom, I don't think is realistic. I think there is a strong desire for human interaction. I think we have been moving to cities for hundreds of years for reasons. Anyone who has any kind of climate agenda, you cannot abandon cities. What you need to do is figure out a different way to work, a different way to operate a restaurant, a different way to use public transportation that is more safe and resilient. We have been told for 15, 20 years that we were going to have something like this. The reality is we did not prepare well. Very few countries prepared well. And what we hope coming out of the end of this is that we'll realize what it will mean in the consumer economy to have a safe and resilient business model and laws that actually allow these businesses to function in a way and meet the demand that I think, to your point, is there.
I was listening the other day to Steve Cohen, who is heading Governor Cuomo's New York Forward initiative. And he reminded everyone on the call that since the dawn of civilization, the shining city on a hill has been what everyone aspires to regardless of where they live. So I believe cities continuing to be important nexus for humanity won't stop. And I just think it's an interesting fact that people are so binary on the subject and the idea that cities will be completely abandoned. I mean, you and I lived in New York City during September 11th, for example, and everyone was convinced that it would be a hotbed for terrorism and for the foreseeable future, which is it was in some regards, and there were still outbreaks of terrorism, and it was quite scary for a few years, but nonetheless, it came back, and it always has. So I think other cities of all shapes and sizes, they'll become better equipped. And in turn, I think it'll be helpful for new retail. And so moving off of the specifics of the crisis, and how it applies to retail, I think is important. You are obviously the custodian of all those relationships across the board at J.P. Morgan. I'd like to talk about new retail through the lens of omni-channel and the media value of retail, the marketing value of retail, the concentration of retail in the right environments. And how are you seeing retail from its largest big boxes to more digital native brands that are newer on your radar? And how do you see them accelerating things and that were maybe already on the boardroom table, which otherwise might have taken 5 years, but are happening quicker now?
We have 3 hours. It's exactly the right question. So, I think, Morty, you said something at the beginning, which I think is important, which is this crisis accelerates a number of things that have been going on already. The notion that in large swaths of the developed world that we are overstored, I think is going to be obviously completely accelerated by it. In the U.S. alone, we've been running at sort of 6,000 store closures or so. We thought we were going to peak at 9,000 and probably be about 15,000 this year. Every retailer that we work with in most of the economies that they trade in are seeing a smaller footprint, smaller box, and a box that needs to be reconfigured in some way. In the case of specialty retail, if you look at the model that you have there, a lot of the labor, a lot of the rent is part of the debate and what's on the table now. How can I reconfigure at lower volumes something that actually replicates the sort of four-wall EBITDA that I had before, which was probably in the low teens %? That is going to be for a number of companies that were already under pressure from whoever the boogeyman was in their world, whether it was fast fashion, whether it was outlets, whether it was the growth of e-commerce. The ones that have been functioning well and that will survive have been doing 5 or 6 things correctly in the past. They had a brand proposition that people cared about and that they felt some emotional connection to. Blinding glimpse of the obvious, but important. These are the companies that if they went away, you would miss them. And there are whole swaths of retail where if you heard XYZ closed, there's not a constituency of people go, my life has been changed in a fundamental way. Secondly, the investment in technology, whether it's through loyalty, e-commerce, in-store capabilities, you knew you needed to do more of that. And that capability became actually a lifesaver and kept the lights on for many of these businesses, throughout the crisis. I do not believe, Morty, to your point, that most of these retailers will discover that suddenly they were doing 15, they spiked to 13% of their volume, and now they can do 70% of their volume, online. I don't think most of these brands or companies are set up that way. But those companies that had all 3 or 4 of those capabilities, I think, will survive in a smaller footprint globally. The bigger box is more challenging. They had more existential issues. We had seen every year more closures and repurposing of the large box real estate department stores. There were some interesting things that I think were going on that will be accelerated through this. There were a number of these companies, the Nordstroms of the world, that actually had historically a very good digital business, well executed, and something that was part of the corporate DNA. I think that will continue to get used and augmented in the department store space. You were seeing experimentation with smaller formats and different models in a weird sort of way, going back to the original founding of department stores with more of a concession model, bringing in, in the case of a Kohl's, a Lidl, or an Aldi, in the case of a Nordstrom's, doing some very interesting things with local retailers and local preferences. So I think that gets accelerated as well. But I do think a large part of the department store segment gets completely repurposed.
There are some groups trying to make the case for a digital radius clause, which would imply that a real estate developer is investing hundreds of millions of dollars, billions of dollars in these huge shopping environments, and therefore now seeking credit for the fact that if a customer does come and walk through the shopping center and see the brand, but live within a certain radius, that they should be able to audit the digital business of that brand. I think it's a little bit of a hard sell, but do you think that could start to get traction, or is that something that you feel maybe a bit far-fetched for the time being?
I don't think it feels far-fetched. I think it sounds like a difficult proposition to roll out. What I do think is, in what you're saying, there is an element of where the world is probably going to go. And what I mean by that is, I think using technology in some ways to level the playing field. We're sitting here talking about, large mall owners, large box retail. The reality is, in large swaths of the countries we work in, retail is a small business. So, we need to figure out ways to use technology through payment systems, through more resilient supply chain enabled technology to actually allow those companies to participate in a more balanced way. The other issue you allude to with these large mall owners is there is an instability now between the expectations of how the companies were financed and built and what retailers can actually provide in the intermediate term and probably over the longer term. So that rebalancing, whether it's through technology, whether it's through some reconfiguration and more partnership of what their leases look like, that's got to happen because the stress to the system is too strong.
We'll be right back. I want to take a second to explain to you why Traub is able to bring you the safari. We pride ourselves in being at the very center of a very global, very complicated consumer and retail landscape. And in our travels, as we help think, manage, and expand businesses in many different channels and geographies, we're able to meet and learn from some of the great minds in this industry, and it's really wonderful to be able to bring them to you. And in doing so, I hope that you, the listener, will be able to learn a little bit more about what we do at Traub as well. Back to the safari. So let's try and reconcile two things that are on your resume, which I think are really interesting. Global being the one word and retail being the other. So I found historically, I've actually been at times frustrated by the American brand community. And I say this obviously with love and affection. I'm American, even though I don't sound it, and have acted in the rather, I think that American businesses have sometimes acted in a rather provincial manner towards globalization. I would say that even J. Crew and Victoria's Secret, frankly, refused to go international for decades, at least because they felt they had enough on their plate here, and they may have been right at that moment in time. But I think today, I think they might have felt differently about that had they gone a bit quicker. And I'm not saying necessarily the same thing about department stores, but, it's harder to do for them. But how do you see a retail environment in the United States, historically absent a few like Gap and maybe a handful of others, have really not become true global players like Inditex or H&M. Even the French and Italian luxury players have been global for decades. The Americans tend to be happy here. So do you feel that some of these bankruptcies have, at part of their root, maybe a history of companies not being global enough, being content with being in the shining country on the hill as we are here? And even after 2008, they, when the ceiling came down a bit, they really didn't act fast enough to try and do things differently and act differently. Is there any learnings there?
Yeah, no, it's a fascinating question. So I think it's a function of three or four things. The first is what you alluded to before, the scale of this market. This is, you've got 70% of GDP in this country or human consumption. So the idea of a company needing to go somewhere else over the last 20 or 30 years, it fit a very small group of people. And so the reality is, when you made your big move as an American retailer, you're like, I'm going international. I'm going to Canada or I'm going to Mexico. What then happened was, because we have the robust capital markets that we do, there were a lot of business models and companies in retail that were funded that were not earning their cost of capital. So how did we get so overstored? Because we were actually in the debt and equity markets funding companies that weren't generating values for their investors or their shareholders. So that was sort of allowed to happen. I'd say that the third reason was American management teams tended to be, by background, pretty insular, pretty US focused, did not get the international training that you would at a European company. So if you were a hot shot at, Macy's or pick your large company in the 80s or 90s, opening up a foreign market was not part of your DNA or mission. You compare that to a Tesco or someone whoever your peer was in Europe, you were sent to open up Taiwan. You were sent to open. So you had management teams that, while they may be from a particular country of origin, had more international experience and were more comfortable doing it. So those are the first couple of things. And then I think lastly, to your point, will they have to look at this now? Yes, I think so. There are certain models that we have that do translate well. We do have generations of management teams who have more experience. They're probably not as international as some of their European peers. I think the challenge for the US companies will be, in the developed markets, you actually have the sort of national champion in each category who's been defined. And you can go through in the department store space, you can go in the hypermarket space. So you're entering a market that's already pretty tough. And in the case of emerging markets, you not only have a lot of your major international competitors either trying to compete with you there, trying to compete with the local competition having pulled out because they haven't been able to make money. There's been as much exiting of some of these emerging markets as there has been entry. And then you have strong local champions. And the challenge, I think, with many of the emerging markets, particularly in Asia, is they are skipping whole phases of retail. So, they've sort of looked at department stores, for example, and said, those are interesting. I understand why you had those, but I'm going to, through this digital enabling technology I have, I'm going to completely skip that. I think there's something to it, Morty, but I think it's a very challenging proposition right now for anyone to do it. And then the thing to layer into that could be a casualty of COVID is, how do we feel about the globalization of our economic system? How do we feel about global sourcing? How do we feel about our own brands versus other people's brands, which, is one of the tougher questions coming out the other end.
Yeah, I agree. It's interesting. You referenced the homegrown guys in these markets. And so, we reference the term, the rise of the rest. And there's an amazing book by Fareed Zakaria, who's, the famous CNN GPS guy. And he wrote this book, which is sort of an inflammatory name, but I think it by design, just to get attention. It's called the Post-American World. But in no means is it meant to be the decline of America. It just means that the rise of the rest. And I think sometimes certain brands, maybe more today than 3 or 4 years ago, have arrived in these markets and realized in India and Russia and the Middle East and these amazing homegrown companies who have built themselves on the backbones of learning from the international companies that they had franchised into their territories. And they say, what, I'm just going to do it myself now, not pay any royalty. And I know my, customer better than they do. I'll put my name on it. And you've got an incredibly powerful local player who now finds themselves starting to actually be the new strategics. They want to go and buy brands in the West and act as a new ecosystem of players out there. So do you find that in your sort of new buyer universe, maybe?
Definitely. And I think, we're seeing some of these in a bunch of categories, in accessories, in athletics, even in food, obviously for different reasons. But we're seeing large local players now looking back at the United States, looking at Europe, looking at Latin America, saying, I'm actually going to be the acquirer, as opposed to what I may have been thinking about 2 or 3 years ago, or 5 or 6 years ago, being a licensee. And I think, to some degree, this story is about where's the capital. And I think, right now the capital is accumulated and poised to pounce. I think in some. And by the way, it's not just China. It's I think you can see Korean companies doing this. I think Japanese companies where there's a fair amount of capital, not a lot of growth. So that's what I think would be an unfortunate casualty of COVID would be for us to throw globalization out with some of the benefits out with the bathwater, rather than saying we need to think a little bit more about championing our local industries. We need to think about supply chain. We need a global, inclusive consumer culture that respects people's brands and ideas. To me, that could be the exciting thing that comes out of this, with some leadership and some good thinking.
So the private equity landscape coming into this recession or COVID situation had trillions of dollars sitting on the sidelines. So as these guys are looking at the landscape today, they're either going to be looking at distressed businesses or trying to really focus on the companies that are thriving. So, we got lucky enough to buy a company a year and a half ago named Signature Brands, which is in the cake decorating business. And, we were obviously planning for being at the top of the economic cycle, but we, didn't expect everyone being locked at home baking cookies and decorating cookies with their kids either. So, that business is up 50% in some categories. And, on the other hand, you have the restaurant industry that, has been obviously decimated in some areas, depending on where you are. So as an investor, where are you looking? How do you assess as a private equity company looking at this landscape through the lens of the haves and the have-nots?
Yeah. So you're right that there is a tremendous amount of private equity on the sidelines that could be deployed in thoughtful ways. And I would not only just, flag the, conventional buyout community, the venture capital community, who've all been very active in consumer retail over the years. But you've also got other pockets that make that even larger. You've got sovereign wealth funds who are active investors in the space. Increasingly, you have family offices doing things. So what the good news is, there is this private pool of capital that, depending on the sector and the situation, can be deployed in an appropriate way to try to change some of this stuff. What we are seeing is a couple of consistent themes when we talk to that universe. Number one is the last couple of months have really been about their own portfolios. And so all these questions we've had about, how do I reopen my restaurant company? How do I think about consolidation? How do I think about my supply chain? They have been in a massive sort of hurry up offense exercise to make sure everything was okay at home. They are now starting to transition the conversation to a couple of things thematically. Generally, the better firms are saying, I don't believe in anything fundamentally different than I did before. I'm not suddenly going to turn into a food service investor if I've never invested in food service. But if I believe that 5 or 6 things were going to happen with the consumer and with retail, where does this experience and what comes out of COVID, where does that accentuate that theme? What I'm also saying is, if I'm in the private equity community, is, and I'm probably going to start with places I've been before. What are the companies that I know? What are the sectors that I know? So you can see that with, KKR's investment in U.S. food service. You will see that with a lot of these firms partnering on things that they wanted to buy before and lost out on to another partner. So they're thinking about all of that. There has not been as much PIPE activity, private investment in public companies, as we thought. Not as much buyout activity yet, because I think that comes later. Part of what's happening, Morty, particularly in the US, is the equity, debt, and convertible markets have been so robust. The biggest competition, if you're at a large buyout firm, is not a large buyout firm, but public convert investors and public equity investors. So as long as that market continues to function well, there may not be as much opportunity. What they're also trying to get their hands around in retail and restaurants is, how do you come up with something systemic for a fragmented industry? And what I mean by that is, if you have, the vast majority of retail and restaurants are small businesses, which they are in this country, and you're looking at, 17, 18% of GDP. You've got some of the most vulnerable workers in the world in terms of these are the people that, Andrew Yang were worried were going to be out of jobs based on technology, and we're sort of starting to see what that would look like. They're trying to figure out other ways to deploy their capital as structured in some sort of systemic solution. And so it's probably some of the most interesting conversations we've had, via Zoom over the last couple of months, and more to come.
The private equity community is obviously going to be assessing the landscape, but what about the strategics? I feel that the large CPG companies, Hershey, Pepsi, P&G, they've been buying their innovation for years, but I haven't seen that happening as much in the broader retail landscape. What do you think about the strategics and, digital natives coming together?
So the strategics, absolutely. I think there are portions of the consumer retail universe that are still in liquidity crisis mode. I can't afford to do anything. I just need to manage what I have. And that's, you can imagine who those brands and companies are. The regular way M&A conversation with some of the bigger, more well-capitalized strategics started much quicker than I thought. And you haven't seen a lot of transaction activity, but based on our conversations, you are starting to see exactly what you said, Morty, which is I realized I knew I needed these capabilities, and who has them, and how can I either organically build them, or in many cases acquire them. If I were someone in that situation right now, I would watch what Walmart has done over the last 4 or 5 years. What they've done with Jet and what they've done in India is really interesting in the sense that the challenge for these companies that are public companies to have the courage to say, I'm going to actually pay a very aggressive multiple compared to my own multiple, deploy $1 billion worth of capital to better compete with digitally native companies and continue to be relevant to our customer, takes a lot of strategic courage. You do not have a lot of great stories yet in the public markets of quote unquote traditional incumbent companies being able to effectively pull that off. I think Walmart is absolutely the gold standard and should give people some confidence to do that. So to your point, I do think what we're also seeing is we've had really interesting conversations with digitally native companies where they've sort of said, okay, I'm in a discretionary business. I am surviving through this, but my volumes are getting hit. I now know what it feels like to have one channel with my customer. I know there are capabilities and capital that I need that may be better set up for me if I'm on another platform rather than doing another round. So I think there's going to be some really interesting, potentially what I'll call sort of, marriages between digitally native brands that are big ideas with a real customer base with traditional platforms that they respect. And what I like about this batch of entrepreneurs, Morty, is that they're realistic about what they're good at and what they've created and what they've changed, but they're also respectful of some of the qualities that some of the better branded companies have in a way that I did not experience in the late 90s, where if you didn't get it, if you were ever in the Procter & Gamble training program, you didn't get it.
So as we start to wrap this up, the future is something that none of us can truly predict, but we tend to finish off this safari with talking about with our guests, where the rays of sunlight may be. And obviously, people love to focus on the negative, and I think the negative is too frequently overshadowing logic and data. But from your perspective, give us a few things that you're looking at that give you pause for hope, encouragement, and really the last word is yours.
Morty, I think the things that give me hope is I think that the empathetic reaction that will happen in the consumer economy about thinking, I'm going to continue to consume, but what is it that I'm going to consume and how am I going to do it is going to be much more of an existential question or important question than it probably has been in the past. So, I think it's going to affect a number of areas. Number one, I'm personally very focused on food. And I think the story that I'm going to see coming out of this, I hope, in terms of food and health, is that people realize this crisis started based on the search for protein in some way, shape, or form, that we have a food supply chain that is in need of transformation to make it healthier, more sustainable, and more democratic at scale. And I think what the exciting thing for me is we already had some of the best companies in the world, whether it's innovators like Beyond Meat or large agricultural companies like Cargill. They all know we need to transform the food system and make it healthier and more sustainable. I think that will absolutely be a mission coming out of this. I think there'll be more focus on stakeholder capitalism. We as a firm, including our leader, Mr. Diamond at the Business Roundtable, have been pushing this. And I think the drumbeat around what you need to do in terms of ESG is going to get even louder. There's some really interesting things that are being done at some of the biggest companies in the world, the Unilevers of the world, the LVMHs, to do really interesting stuff there. I think the enabling nature of technology now is incredibly exciting. What we can learn in industries and segments that value creativity, marrying creativity and data and technology is super exciting to me. And we're seeing that again around, some of the stuff that LVMH is doing. Blockchain is all super exciting to me. So those, I would say, are the main things that we're focused on. But I think you will have out of this a more sustainable, more inclusive, more dynamic consumer economy, which, whether it involves the right people on the board, whether it involves consumers, as Gloria Steinem would say, your checkbook reflects your values, investing in companies and buying from companies. We understand the supply chain, where things come from, how it was made. I think that's all exciting. There is a very tough period of restart that you have to get through. The consumer's damaged. They're feeling, particularly put out. They've generally lost a loved one or know someone. So the notion that you're going to go out and start consuming in tremendous volume is probably optimistic. But I do think it will come back, and I think it will be the kind of things that we were talking around retail and technology. And the good news is that we're about to have a generational baton pass in terms of purchasing power from the boomers to younger generations. And I think they have a focus on all these things and will drive much of it and ignore them, consumer and retail companies at your peril.
J.P. Morgan's Global Head of Consumer and Retail Investment Banking, Erik Oken, thanks for joining me on the Safari.
Thank you for having me.
If you want to learn a little bit more about Traub, you can go to traub.io, where you'll learn a lot about everything that we do. If you're enjoying the Safari, please do share it with your friends and colleagues within the industry. And please also don't forget to subscribe and like it. Until next time.